Okay, so it's really a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Laura has been in Cambridge for quite a long time, and she now works for Overstory. She'll talk to us about fighting climate change, thousands of trees at a time, rather than one at a time. And also, this is the first seminar for the year, so it's wonderful to start with you. So thank you so much, and you're all set.
Well, thank you, everybody. So today, I'm going to be giving you a little bit of the industrial take on some of Earth observation and machine learning for climate. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the specific challenges we have as a business there. And hopefully this will be interesting in that we are both very large scale, but also very small scale in how we work at Overstory. So, if a tree falls and there's no one around to hear it, does it start fire? The unfortunate answer is yes, and fires caused by tree strike on power line are the most devastating in terms of the area of forest burned in the US. This is really consistent, and unfortunately it just keeps happening. More and more vast acreages burned because of tree strikes on power lines. And we're getting more of this. The fire has bigger impact and tree strikes are happening more often because of all the reasons that you see here. I'm not going to read them out, but the world is getting hotter, the weather is getting less predictable, and trees and electricity are just getting closer together. We want to electrify the grid. That generally means more overground power lines. Overground is a factor of 10 cheaper than underground power, so it's what we have in large parts of the world. And unfortunately, we also like trees, so they are often statistically near power lines. And those fires are just huge. So that is what Overstory exists to do. We want to stop trees hitting power lines. That's our short-term aim. As a company, we have a dream that we will actually monitor all the vegetation on the planet as close to real time as we can. But we are starting with something a little bit more tractable, keeping trees from hitting power lines. And whilst I'm going to talk today a lot about Earth observation and remote sensing and satellites and machine learning, the reality is this is very grounded work. It comes down to people like this, who are on the ground with the power lines, utility company vegetation managers. And I'm just going to mention this because it is kind of devastating. One of my colleagues is at one of the big meetings for American cooperative utilities right now. And they've just heard that in 2023, I think it was about 20 vegetation managers were killed in the field by fire or tree damage or helicopter crashes or other things. This is a really risky profession, but we are always very aware that what we do, it's all lovely fluffy data, but some people are out there on the ground really dealing with it day to day. And we're here to try to make their lives easier and safer, as well as stopping those trees hitting power lines. And the thing with power lines is there's a lot of them. Most of Overstory's customers are in the continental US right now, and the mileage just adds up. This is not a few trees, it's a lot of trees, it's a lot of power lines. And so the solutions we have to work with have to work at scale. And that's where satellites are awesome. Satellites have the capability to look at tens of thousands of miles of power line, the numerous trees around those power lines, at a reasonable price point for the level of detail you get and how often you can go take those pictures. And we have more satellites than ever before, both optical and SAR sensors. There are just more every year. And as well as more, we're seeing higher resolution, more bands, more frequency of data. It is getting easier to use satellites to observe the world, which is good. So, here's a picture of some trees. There are lots of trees around. We can zoom in, and I'll show you some more zooming and what Overstory does there. And we also use hyperspectral. This is really powerful for trees. It lets us check the health of the trees and how well they are doing, as well as just seeing the raw RGB color. And so we have to do some various pieces of analysis to understand everything about the trees. But this bit is just to show you one of the hard problems, which is that the Earth is not flat and it also is not round. And unfortunately, that means that one of the things that our utility foresters really care about, which is how tall the tree is relative to how tall the power line is is a surprisingly difficult technical challenge. Because Overstory works at the individual tree level, as well as the tens of thousands of miles of power line level. We need to know how tall that tree is relative to the power line, and that means quite a high level of accuracy. And yet, the Earth is bumpy, and we just have a couple of satellite photos to determine the height width, which is an interesting problem. But we usually start off with some basic segmentation, trying to see what's tree, what's not tree. We can put the power lines on top of it. This is a simplified view of how Overstory works. And the satellites give us a few benefits as we try to bring together that power line data and the satellite data. Foot patrols is actually, and truck patrols, is actually how a lot of vegetation management happens in the US right now. Vegetation managers drive by, or if you've got a lot of money, fly by the power lines every few years, 5 years, 8 years, and have a look. How are the trees looking? Do we need to trim these ones lately? But it actually turns out that if you only go look at trees every 5 to 8 years, a lot has happened in the meantime. And so the timeliness and the cost of that is really great. Now, LiDAR, you can fly LiDAR from a plane, and that's pretty nice, except for the fact that it gets out of date quickly, and you usually only learn about the physical characteristics of the tree. Sometimes you might get visual as well. But it's also quite expensive if you're actually paying a plane to fly over your lines. Again, this adds up quickly. Satellite is usually cheaper, and it's pretty quick. From us requesting some satellite imagery, to us getting the imagery and us getting insights from our customers can be very quick. And we are talking about quite high resolution imagery. For Overstory's primary features, we can do most of our delivery with a 50 centimeter pixel size hyperspectral imaging. But for the really interesting things, like tree health, tree species, we buy 30 centimeter imagery. So with that, we're really getting quite a rich picture of each individual tree, which is the level that we care about. So, what matters to our customers?
Sorry, can I say?
Yeah.
This 30 centimeter stuff is super expensive, isn't it? I mean.
Ah, but we're a business, you see, yeah, we're offering a valuable customer service. So yes, 30 centimeter is not cheap, but it's priced into Overstory's service offering. So our customers are utilities. They're usually buying a subscription from us, maybe 3 years or 5 years. Every year we get fresh imagery of the trees that they care about, and we produce this rich intelligence analysis for them. And right now, the way that they're doing their vegetation management, those guys walking, driving along, flying a helicopter, it's expensive. And that's just to work out where you need to trim. You actually then need to send out the crew with the chainsaws to go and deal with that later as well. It is incredibly expensive. And so although the imagery is expensive, and obviously Overstory does charge more than the imagery costs for all of the fancy science that we do, it's still so much cheaper than flying a helicopter along your lines every 5 years, or sending people out to the most remote areas of America to go look at those power lines. So yes, but that means we're really lucky because Overstory has a business model, means we can buy 30 and 50 centimeter imagery, which means that we can have a route from this micro focus that I'm talking about today up to our long-term vision. Every single customer does 2 things towards our long-term vision of solving the climate crisis. One thing is we help that customer stop trees hitting power lines, which is good for climate, less wildfire, less power outages. And secondly, we get a lot more high resolution imagery of trees. And that means our machine learning models get better, our data science get better, and we start to have more generalized models so we can imagine a world where we can understand much larger scale trees. So we get kind of a win both ways, but it is unique to our business model.
Okay,
that we can actually access this sort of data at the high resolution. I totally get it. We might be talking about spending tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per customer, depending on the scale of the customer, just to source imagery.
Sure. And it's purely RGB, or do you get more analysis?
Multispectral. So we use near infrared as well, really helpful for tree health.
And
Cool. So our customers care about a lot of different things, which is both annoying and awesome. And these pictures are just arbitrary illustrations, really. You see at the top left, we look here, this is a false color image showing trees that are not healthy. And for some of our customers, that's really important. Trees that are not healthy, they're either sick or they're dying or dead, are more likely to fall over and hit a power line. Also, we're finding quite a lot that we're spotting early signs of tree health problems for our customers. So we have a team of arborists who work with us, which is really great, because all of us from the computer science point of view get to learn about trees from people who really understand them well. And so often we might spot a cluster of, declining trees like this, and arborists will be able to say, that's emerald bark beetle. And because that's emerald bark beetle, we can make predictions about the spread and the impact on the surrounding forest, not just the individual tree where we've identified a problem. Other customers are really worried about wildfire, and we can correlate with the maps of fuel potential in areas of America to track the risk that we're seeing from trees falling on power lines in different ways to the fuel potential, which means you get a much richer picture of the actual wildfire risk. And for some of our customers, that's really critical, because trimming a tree in an area where there's a potential for a much larger burn has a higher value than trimming a tree elsewhere. And if you're thinking, why don't they just trim all the trees? The answer is it is really expensive, and unfortunately these utility companies do not have, believe it or not, infinite budgets. Vegetation management is very tightly cost controlled, so they have to target what money they have, where it's going to have the greatest impact. We've also got here on the bottom left, you can see a corridor. So for transmission power, very high voltage lines, you're often really clear cutting to try to keep absolutely no vegetation near those power structures at all. And so the kind of worries there are a little bit different. The trees are not probably going to fall over onto the power line because the trees are both shorter and well away to the sides. But you're looking for both fuel potential in that low-lying ground and also fast-growing species where you might only have a sapling now, not too much to worry about. But in a couple of years, that sapling could be real tall and actually threatening the power structure. Or the worry could be the fuel potential of vegetation around the foot of the power structure there. So some of our customers really want to hear reassurance that there's really no vegetation or very low-lying vegetation near their power structures. And at the bottom right, you can see one of the more challenging cases where we're looking at really remote power. And actually, as we deploy more things like hydropower, you can expect to see power transmission in really remote areas, a long way from populated areas. So it's a different set of worries there. Big power structures in areas where nobody might be, actually getting people there to manage those lines and to manage the vegetation near them is also a challenge. So everything matters in terms of trees and power lines differently to all of our customers. So we create vegetation data using our satellite systems. We detect the trees, we figure out their height, their health, their species, lots of different things about them. And we combine it with the utilities information about where their power structures are, the risk of wildfire. They often have regulatory requirements as to how near trees can be to power lines. So that's something which we can take into account, say, have you got sufficient clearance around your well? And also things like terrain and slope maps, which matter to the utilities because they need to trim that tree. They have to think about the logistics of getting somebody with a saw to that tree. Is it a truck or on foot, or is it? And if you haven't looked at the videos on YouTube of helicopters with chainsaws dangling from them, do check those out. It is terrifying, but sometimes that is what you have to send, is a helicopter with a long chainsaw dangling from it, because the trees are in a really inaccessible space. And finally, our goal is to help our customers have effective vegetation management programs. And they all have slightly different ways of thinking about this. Some of them talk about hazard trees, and a hazard tree is an individual tree that is at risk of falling on the line. So we have to work out, is the tree big enough to fall on the line? The slope of the ground and the height of the tree relative to the ground, and the distance and all that sort of stuff. They're interested in encroachment. That's more where the tree is physically growing towards the line. Is it overhanging the line? Is it growing into it so that in a wind, the tree is going to hit the power line? And things like reliability forecasts for sections of the power grid. What's the likelihood of a tree strike and how much of the network does it impact? You worry more about the transmission line that feeds the whole town than you might a single distribution line just to one home. The impact of a power outage is really different. And finally, contractor audits as well. One of Overstory's early little bits of impact, which was not the kind of impact we were expecting to have, was one of our early customers looked at the Overstory's results and said, that's really weird. Those trees are really near the power line there. We paid a contractor last year to go trim all that area. Turned out, contractor didn't do it. And they only found it out because we were able to tell them in this remote area, trees haven't been trimmed. Because, again, they're not inspecting their contractors. When they paid somebody with a saw to go out and manage stuff, they're not checking up on that, and we can help with that too. And the business model piece in that third section there is really important, because without it, we won't have data to do interesting data science with. So I always think it's worth remembering that's why we're here. So this is some of the sort of different data layers that we use. Overstory isn't sort of one machine learning model. We use a lot of different kinds of both machine learning and other forms of data science to come up with multiple different kinds of tree analysis. First of all, we have to know where the electricity lines are, and our customers usually have some idea where they are. The accuracy can vary. Sometimes you know exactly where their pylons are because they've flown LiDAR over and they know that very well. At other times, they have a much more rougher data set. So we get really varied data from our customers with the information about where things are. Because we really care about the accuracy, just think that we're down to individual feet often of the tree relative to the power line. So knowing where the power line is as important as knowing where the tree is and how big it is. So we start off with some corrections sometimes to our customer data to make sure that we know where the power structures are and where those power structures are in our imagery, not just relative to a base map, be that Google Maps or OpenStreetMap or whatever. So we have to do some corrections there. Then we do all our different data layers based on the tree stuff, and we bring it all together. And the last point here is about height. I'm going to talk a bit more about height, but tree height is a really gnarly problem. So a lot of our analysis comes together to encroachment risk, and this is showing how our customers think very specifically about the exact detail of where the tree is relative to the power line. So in the diagram on the left, you can see what we call the risk matrix. The black lines are the pylon or the power line structure. And then we have boxes of distance out horizontally and vertically. And each of our customers actually think about the risk of bits of tree being in each of those buckets slightly differently. So this matrix shows the weights for each specific customer. Some folks are really worried about trees that are taller, overhanging, and so they have higher weights in the buckets further up. Others, I think, more worried about side encroachment, and they have higher weights in the horizontal buckets. You probably can't see the numbers on here, but we've got 6-foot vertical buckets and 3-foot horizontal buckets here. And that's, again, just to kind of show you the scale that we're working at, very specific bits of branch.
Should they all care about the same thing, or is it because of the kinds of trees there? We I understand customer A is being bitten once by B, right? But shouldn't they all care about the same things, or is it?
On one level, yes, if everyone's equally worried about everything, but partly because our customers, as they have limited money, and so they have to focus on the risks that really worry them. But also they actually all have slightly different regulatory requirements. So if we came down to the regulation piece, some of them will have absolute clear cutting for X distance from the pole as a regulatory requirement. And that will be different depending on the area, the particular voltage of the power line, that kind of thing.
That complexity about the tree height. I know that surveyors worry about trees near houses that have different root systems, the ones that take up a lot of water out of the ground, and those will presumably do the same thing for power lines because they basically stabilize the ground. So eucalyptus trees are the worst thing you can possibly have. They're hugely deep roots, it takes up all the water down to 10 meters.
Yeah.
Everything nearby falls over, basically. So you can't see that, but you could infer it if you knew the height of the tree.
And you can often see if it's eucalyptus, you might know that that
Yeah,
is and that's exactly the sort of thing. Some of our customers will be like, willows in our area, willows grow really fast. That is the thing that takes up. And so they really double down on willows, and they'll want us to identify all of those. Every customer is a little bit different. You're absolutely right. It is quite a complex environment of different things going on, causing trees to be happy and stable, or sadly less happy. And weather patterns is also something else to think about, the effects of storm damage on local tree structures and so on.
So do you actually do species identification?
Yeah, absolutely. So height, I'm just gonna talk about height first, because this is where we tear our hair out more than most, so. I just want to acknowledge the fact that it is miraculous that here we are in 2024 and a satellite flying overhead at incredible speed and a very long way overhead can take 2 pictures of a tree at 10 seconds apart from a long way up, and we can work out the height of that tree within a couple of feet. Honestly, that's pretty amazing, right? The ground is bumpy. We don't actually know how tall the ground is in a lot of places, which is one of the challenges here, because we're talking about relative height. That's what we care about, the height of the tree relative to the ground. So the first thing we do is we do, this is the website of Centre Varelli, who are a great research institute. Their S2P pipeline, as we call it, is open source. This is the basis of how we do most of our height calculations today. So we get 2 images of a tree, and we do stereo processing to try to work out the height of the tree. So that means spotting across those 2 images. We don't know where the images are. We have to first of all match points so that we know that we're looking at exactly the same area, spotting features that appear in both images and saying, okay, this is the same place. The picture is from different angles, and then work out the geometry, basically, how tall the tree is relative. But we do also need to know how tall the ground is. If any of you have been working with digital terrain models, you'll find that sometimes that data is low resolution, really big pixel size, maybe 10 or 30 meters. And sometimes it's actually wrong. We've actually bought data sets sometimes trying to get really accurate terrain modeling, and we find that sometimes the data is just all over the shop. It's not just that the resolution isn't helpful, but the actual data is just wrong, really inaccurate, tens of meters in some cases, wrong in terms of height. So that's really challenging for actually getting good, accurate height. So we can do this, but it doesn't work as reliably or as accurately as we'd like, which is why I'll talk a little bit more about height. It is miraculous that we can do it at all, but it is tough to do it well. So the ground data is wrong, and matching is also really difficult. So these 2 images that this satellite is taking as it flies overhead might be 10 seconds apart in time. And you think, well, 10 seconds, that's nothing in terms of time, not much has changed on the ground. But actually a lot has changed on the ground. The cars have moved along. The trees have been blown in the wind and are now in a different position. The waves on the lake have moved along and are in a different position. So that very first challenge of matching the locations of the 2 images taken 10 seconds apart is extremely non-trivial, because they're not 2 images of the same thing. They're 2 images of different things. We have to figure that out. So we put a lot of time into thinking about what are the best algorithms to use there. But then, as I say, we've also got the base height to think about. And sometimes if we're looking at trees in mountainous areas, the algorithm just can't do anything at all, and we get gaps. Yes.
Does the satellite geolocation help you with the matching, or is it not precise enough?
Not precise enough, because the ground is bumpy. We get different metadata from different satellite providers around exactly where the satellite is and where it's pointing and so on. But yes, between that and some of the image processing that we have to do with satellite ingestion, I'm not talking a lot about that, but you get the image, you have to do quite a lot of tidying up to make it usable. It's not quite there for this level of quite complex geometry that we're doing here. So yes, matching is still better. Again, we're on a really quite high resolution here, quite a detailed piece. Whereas the tree, just imagine, an oak tree, you have lots of them here, how much it blows from side to side.
Right. I guess I would have thought that like the satellite orbit is relatively stable. So in a fixed amount of time, you should be pretty good at figuring out how far it's gone and the Earth's rotation as well. And that shouldn't be, but it's not good enough.
The other bits of complexity are the cameras aren't ideal. They're taking a picture of bendy stuff, the satellite is moving while the image is captured, there's lots of different pieces going on.
Okay.
Anyway, so satellite stereo pipeline is how we do this today, but we're starting to explore some new techniques which we think will be really exciting. We've just been looking into this paper on monocular height estimation and whether we can actually make do with a single image, what we can do there using we've looked in the past at things like shadow heights, which can give you some estimation of height. If you look at the length of the shadow, where the sun was, assuming your image was taken when there was sun, you can do various things there. This is trying to do it sort of automatically, which we're looking into now. And the Earth observation nerve stuff seems really cool as well. Now, most of the papers and the research, for instance, this paper is, assumes rather more images than we tend to have. We've usually got 2 images. If our customer has paid a lot of money, we'll have 3. So that's 2 from the side and 1, which is close to nadir if possible, straight down image. It's never actually quite straight down. It's usually a bit off through, but better than nothing. But the other papers, nerve papers tend to be pulling in 20-odd images and so doing something interesting, but we think it's an interesting direction to travel. We want to poke out a bit more to see what we can do. So height is challenging. Wildfire risk, I already mentioned. This is really just taking open data maps of the risk of burn in different areas and correlating it with the risks that we're putting together. So that layer is not too difficult. And then strike trees. So this again shows you how we are focused at the individual tree level, working out which trees here have the risk of falling over. So that's trees that are tall enough and close enough to the line that they could potentially impact, with a little bit of margin of error considered. And again, this is how we need to be able to identify the actual individual tree, the crown of the tree, the height of the tree, and all the relative positioning relative to power lines. So that's trees falling in. And tree species as well. So I'm not going to say that we identify all species. We do not. Customers come to us with a specific list of species, perhaps 5 or 6 that they're especially concerned about. And we will tune a model that will try to detect those particular species in their particular area. So it's not a generalized tree species model identification. It's just pinpointing certain species from a given territory. Some species are easier than others. Sometimes our customers will say, can you do Siberian elms? And we'll say, we can do elms, but Siberian elms is a bit specific. So we have to manage customer expectations a little bit here. But our accuracy continues to get better. With 30 centimeter imagery, we can do pretty good. But yeah, definitely something which is continuing as an area of further research. We'd like to do more, better accuracy, more species. So yes.
Are you trying to incorporate observational data from the ground to help augment the satellite data?
Well, interesting enough, that is how we do some of this actually. So one of the challenges in Earth observation is that you don't actually know what's true. We're taking pictures of trees. No one actually knows what's there. And so for tree species, our model does start with labeled data, which is sometimes from ground tree sampling, some on the ground, but most often is from our arborists working with sources like Google Street View. If we have satellite imagery of areas where we've got Street View sideways, nice complement of satellites top down, and so we can use that to say, okay, here's a birch, here's an elm, here's a willow, and that's how we source some of the training data we use for these models.
You could do the height thing by spraying the trees with a drone with dye. If you've done this, it carries out to the canopy, and you can actually even see the tree breathing out of the canopy if you're looking at the right bit of spectrum. So then you can count the time, and you know the osmosis process, how long it takes to transport a certain height. So you can see how long does it take for the leaves to go purple or whatever. Choose a colour that doesn't happen naturally.
I will add that to our pot of radical R&D direction. At the moment, the other thing we're thinking about is this question: how can we get ground truth data at scale? So Google Street View is all very well in urban areas, but you tend not to have very recent Street View in more rural areas. And again, recency really matters here, because even data from a year or two ago can be quite out of date for thinking about the height of a tree. Trees are not static; they keep growing or being trimmed. It is a right pain. So thinking about how we can capture useful ground truth data for both training and for quality checking at scale is a huge challenge for us and something we keep coming back to. We've had little projects experimenting, for instance, with 360 cameras that people could use if they were actually on the ground in the area to do some rapid capture of as many trees as possible. If you've got someone who's just walking down the street, there's some trees, could we automatically capture that, analyze the height and so on, get a really accurate snapshot at a certain point in time. But these things tend to get expensive quickly, but we're still working on it. So species is fun, and tree health as well. And this is an example of one of the outputs we'd have for our customers looking at tree health, showing clusters where trees are particularly not healthy. Again, we're not at the moment doing very graded tree health. It tends just to be a binary classification of healthy or declining. And that might mean the tree is actually almost totally bare, or the leaves are starting to show different coloration from what you would expect, that kind of thing. But again, this is another area where I think we'll be continuing to develop our models over time. Tree health can mean a lot of different things. Maybe we're more interested in certain kinds of tree health than others, but it's very interesting and powerful for our customers. And I will just say one thing I haven't mentioned is, of course, our work is very seasonal. Really good satellite imagery of trees needs to be taken when the leaves are on. And that means there's a finite window, months in the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, where we can actually get good imagery. There's no point in taking a satellite picture right now when most of the trees don't have leaves on them, because if we want to look at tree health and tree species, we really need the leaves for that. It gives us a lot of information about the terrain. And so there's a very narrow window when we can actually call, we task the satellite, we call a bear bus. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We call a bear bus and say, go take some imagery for us. We need to do that during the window when the trees have their leaves and before the leaves start to change colour for the fall. This is actually a climate change challenge as well, because it is increasingly difficult to predict when that window will be, where we can rely on the trees having healthy leaves for us to take pictures of. Because with climate shifting, traditional patterns are not always as reliable as when you might expect trees to be full in leaf or not in an area. So that's also something that challenges us in terms of sourcing good data. So we put it all together and our customers get a beautiful analysis of their risk. They can drill down to the individual trees, a lot of data about an individual single wire and the trees next to it, the health of those trees, the species of those trees, how near they are, whether they can fall on the cable. And that helps our customers do vegetation management planning at the micro level. And we also give them a dashboard of their network at the macro level, which, as I say, could be tens of thousands of miles of cable, helping them figure out exactly where they need to manage their vegetation. And you can kind of see here a little bit, it's still all very separate layers. We're doing very different, the tree height is one sort of set of data science. The tree species is another model, tree health is another model again, and the segmentation that tells us whether something is trees or not trees is yet another model. One of the things we want to be working on next is how we can start to bring those together to cross-correlate a little bit more than we have done historically, to try to bring those models together and use them to help make each other more accurate. And another research direction, which we're just starting to touch on very slightly, is the slightly more radical idea. So back in the early days of self-driving, Tesla had a very different approach to traditional automobile manufacturers. They were using visual imagery rather than the LiDAR or radar-based range finding. And they did that by building models of the world and simulating things in the visual space. And so we've started to wonder, is that something we could do for trees? Could we have a complete simulation model of trees where we start to experiment and see whether that gives us a different way to determine tree heights and things as well, by modeling trees in a lot more detail. We've done some extremely initial explorations of what that might look like with some different simulation environments and construction methods. But I think this might be an interesting thing for us to try as a sort of second way of approaching this, thinking about what trees look like. If we've got a satellite image, could we generate a 3D model of each of those trees and use that to inform rather than these different approaches that we have today? So it feels like there's still a lot of different things we can do that we haven't done to date to try to tackle this problem of how can we understand trees at an individual tree level, but at really large scale for millions and billions of trees at some point. So it's just a quick image of some of our early experimentation with different kinds of trees, because there's a lot of them. So we need large scale solutions, and we do care about the individual tree as well. And so making our solutions scalable really matters. Overstory is pretty much entirely a Python shop at this point. We use Jupyter Hub a lot, and Dask and Dagster to help us both parallelize our stuff, Again, lots of different models, each needs a slightly different sort of set of compute, set of challenges, and Dagster is our primary orchestration tool to try to sort of tweak everything together. So, yeah, Overstory, that's a little bit of what we do, why we do it, some of the technical side. We are very much people who care about trees. Yeah, I'm very much grounded. When we get together, we do like to go and see trees. Because it is that kind of business. We do want to always remain connected to the very tangible realities on the ground and not to get distracted by the wonderful world of machine learning too much. This is actually a year ago, and the team has, I'm just trying to count, we're probably 3 times as many now. So quite a lot. Turns out, a lot of trees we looked at. So that was a whistle-stop tour. Really happy to chat about any more of that. So I didn't want to go into too much detail on any individual point.
Any kind of questions? Yeah, Megan?
I was wondering how, or have you been able to sort of evaluate your alerts at a high level and say we've reduced risk and how much and how did, like, what did you find?
It's really difficult because, of course, the risk of tree strikes, you don't know what didn't happen. So it's definitely something we'd like to do more of, but I wouldn't say that we have really solid data at the moment. But it is something our customers track for themselves. Their metrics around tree strikes, outages of fire are super critical to their businesses. So it will be really interesting over the next few years. We're still, most of our customers, we've been working with them for at most 2 years. I think we've got one customer we've been working with for 3 years now. So getting that longevity of data will also be really helpful in trying to understand this. And I didn't talk about year to year either, but that's also something which we'll be starting to look at a little bit more. We do this scan every year, starting to think about trends over time, and so on is something else which we've not done a lot of yet. Yeah, and definitely goes to impact over time as well.
So along the same lines, like, do you track the extent to which, like, when you tell a customer, you know, you should be concerned by this tree, and then they go out and like send their own arborist, like, was it correct? Was it actually the height, the way that you thought it would be, or the distance way you thought it would be, the height you thought it would be? Would they have actually classified it as risky, and the extent to which it's accurate in that respect?
Yeah, so actually what we found over the last year is when we ship our results to customers for the first time, so we've done a satellite analysis and we send over there, we say, you can log into the website and see your information now. We usually also do send an arborist along with our customer success team to meet the customer and often do a field visit. So we often get that data straight away. They will go out and look at some of the trees in areas that are both accessible and interesting. And so we'll often get small scale feedback at the individual tree level for a full selection of trees very quickly, which can be really good, or sometimes means that we're doing a rapid round of corrections if we haven't quite hit the spot with the first pass of the analysis.
Okay.
But it's very sample based, right? And I think that's always a challenge for us because we want to have a solution that works for a customer who has tens of thousands of miles of cable. Even if you go out in the field for a couple of days and you drive around a little bit, you're only seeing a handful of trees and locations. And so but it's really great data for us. Those random samples still give us a lot to then improve our models taking forward for the bigger scale piece. The quality keeps going up and the right all doing well.
So can this integrate jurisdictionally into planning where to add new power lines and minimize risk and do projections and so on, or is it purely an ex post analysis of?
For us, it's expert. We're working with the physical power lines that are there today, but we definitely have had customers first thinking about planning and scoping as well. As long as customers can tell each other that poles would be, we can certainly do something like that, yeah.
You're not doing it right now, they're not incorporating this planning into.
Not that I'm aware of for our current set of customers. So I'm also losing track of how many customers we have though, so. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have different types of algorithms or accuracies on trees within forests and outside of forests, and how does that work?
So again, different for each of our analysis layers, but absolutely, really dense forests can be both very uniform or very disparate. I will say our height stuff really struggles when we've got outlier trees. the individual palm tree by itself in a desert, or the one really tall tree in the middle of a large forest tends to be a lot harder to get right. So the accuracy there is not quite so good with our current techniques. Things like species can be pretty good in a forest setting, not too bad. And tree health, again, one of the challenges, right, it's satellites, so it's top down. So in a dense forest, you might have vegetation you just can't see. You can only see top down. So for tree health, if the top level canopy is sick, we can spot that no problem, and that's pretty good. But there could be a shorter tree which just isn't showing at the top level, which is actually sick and at a full risk. Luckily, we usually haven't got power cables going through the middle of the densest forests, except where you have, like the forest is very dense and very tall, and you've got lower lines kind of coming through. But that's a very different risk pattern to the big transmission corridors that I showed in. So I guess the answer is probably it varies, unfortunately. And generally things vary quite a lot in the different settings. Again, rural, dense forest, more deserty settings, each time it's a really different set of terrain features, really different set of trees and variety of trees. And so our accuracy is not kind of even across everything. It really does vary a lot at the moment.
And I guess like a follow-on question to that, how much are you, like, when you get a new customer, how much are you really like designing a model and everything for their specific use case, and how much are you reusing, like?
We are a product company, so we're moving towards being able to do it all automatically. Things like segmentation of what's a tree or not a tree is pretty standard, although if we get a customer in a very different kind of physical region with very different tree types, then we'll often have to fine tune the model we have. The species, for each customer who has a species, not everyone pays for species, because that's a little bit harder, it's more expensive. But the customers who get species, they each have a different set of species, so we tend to be working on fresh training for them within an existing model framework. So it varies, but our dream is to get towards a standard offering, or at least a standard set of things where we can pick and choose and say, okay, this is a foresty area, we'll be using this model here. Okay, that's desert, we'll use this system over here. So, yeah. Obviously, accuracy is hard to measure, that's the other thing, right? We get random sample data for accuracy, but we can't do, there is no ground truth at scale. We can compare to third-party data sources, so we do obviously work with lower resolution open data sets for things like land use cover. But again, there's a timeliness and an accuracy factor for us. If we're really interested in exactly how high the tree is, really this year, and actually this year the tree grows a couple of meters, there's a limit to what we can do with open data, which tends to be either very low resolution or not so timely.
Yeah. Could you explain a bit more on the slides of Tesla for trees? What's the image about? How is that related to like the real simulation of Tesla?
Honestly, we have no idea, but we feel there is something there that could be done.
Because I'm just interested in spending a few more seconds on that
Yeah,
slide to
so-
find out what it's about.
So right now, we take satellite data and we do various things to try to model the tree. It's very much a 2D analysis. We're always presenting essentially a raster, a set of pixels for what we've got. And that just feels wrong, because trees are three-dimensional. So shouldn't we have three-dimensional models? That feels like it's where we want to go. But how can we get there when all we have is 2D or at best, let's say, a satellite stereo image of the trees? And so we started to think about maybe you could do something different. We can get 3D data about trees from other sources, like different species, what kind of shapes have they got, what kind of sizes they've got. You can easily imagine we could create some models like that, and we could have them in a 3D simulation environment. And then we could start to test lots of different simulations and see what was real, against, say, a ground truth of here's some satellite imagery. And maybe that would help us refine something where in the end we could, our dream would be to get something where with satellite images, we could then say, okay, here is our guess as a 3D model of that tree, because we know roughly how tall it is. We know it's an oak. What are the, we know the shape of the tree crown. So there's only a limited number of 3D models of oak that could give us an oak that is this many meters high and has this shape of tree crown. So maybe we could model that and use that as a basis for a 3D understanding of trees, doing it entirely by fully simulated trees based on what we know from other sources of 3D trees. But then what could we, would that make sense? honestly, this is like, we've spent like 2 days thinking about this, but it just felt like there was something there.
So it's like a constraint, constrained by the bio, structural properties of the tree.
We know it's a tree.
Yeah.
Right? That narrows it down, and we do have other bits of data about the tree. So a different approach would be doing some, I say, a lot of different simulations. with
Maybe
different
you should mention what you're doing with the monocular.
Yeah, we haven't shot the molecular. So you also mentioned like the molecular from satellite, we're interested in investigating some molecular reconstruction algorithm, but from the HB image from the close range survey, not from the spaceborne missions. But yeah, the thing you are presenting is very interesting. I'm very interested in like what your takeaways from Tesla, how is that relevant to that slide? So,
Well, that was our exciting tagline to try to develop the 3D simulation idea, but it is a good way to capture the way Tesla went about that, of just creating a lot of different real world models and then starting to bring their 2D imagery from the cars in. That gave us this idea that maybe you could do something similar for trees. Trees are a constrained space, right? This should be a very feasible problem, she says. If we burn a lot of compute over a period of time, but it just felt like there was something there that we could try that would give us, let's say, just a radically different way of thinking about trees. And we do think, 3D is the way to go, right? We are very constrained by the 2D perspective of what we know are 3D objects. So what are the different ways we could start to get towards that while still operating at our scale of lots of trees? Simulations seem like a possible direction, but I say it's like totally early days. We spent literally one person, 2 days, seeing what might be possible. And the idea, well, we left that thinking, we should come back to this. It feels like.
What we're doing is, so Gian has been working with Unreal Game Engine.
Right.
And basically ALS, which is airborne. So you just mentioned, we get point clouds and we can import that into Game Engine. Then we can sort of do a 3D reconstruction, but our goal is to try and do monocular reconstruction with just one camera going across. So we could potentially import quite a lot of trees into Unreal Game Engine, and it takes time, etc. So we are very close, and that's something we're super interested in actually.
Yeah, let's
Just
have a
because-
follow-up conversation. That would be really good. I think we were sort of thinking, Blender, what could we do if we started to have some 3D trees?
Yeah, I mean, the big vision is that, you can go from real to sim. And then in the sim world, you can not just do trees, but also you can do biodiversity. You can actually put in animals and insects and things like that, train AI and go from sim back to real again. And then when you go out there, you can do few shot learning or more than zero shot learning of the AI because you trained it. Exactly what Tesla was trying to do. So this is basically, I did it, Andrew Blake, who did this thing called, he worked in the Airson in Microsoft. Airson, with the drones, simulation of drone pathways. And then there's a company called AirGen, it's a spin-off, which is essentially doing the same thing. So we're working with AirGen. And we have their whatever data core or whatever, but we can actually, so Iha can take a virtual drone, fly it over a virtual forest, and then see what would have a real drone would have seen if you were there. So you kind of work, train completely in the virtual world, and then you come back in the real world. So that's where this sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But I had a question for you, this is different, but in terms of tree strikes and so on, what fraction of them happen in suburban sort of distribution level as opposed to, intercity, high tension?
That's a good question. I did not have the answer off the top of my head.
Okay, because I mean, I worked in the power grid for many years, and my sense is that almost all of your tree strikes are going to be happening in the distribution level, which is not at the intercity transmission. Because the transmission towers at the intercity level, the 400 kilovolt, 150 kilovolt and higher, are all going to be these multi-tier tall things.
That's right. Tree strikes are not so much an issue, but there can still be damage to the pylons even if they don't hit the poles. Let's say there's a risk around a fire at the base of a pylon structure, damaging the metal, which then leads.
Right, and those things also have whatever protections built in. So, I mean, just to give you a sense of there's a pylon I used to live near Toronto. There's a pylon which goes to Niagara Falls, which crosses over the busiest motorway in Canada. The four is busier than anything in California, super busy. And the pylons cross over, it's 400 kilovolts. And I asked the people, how do you do this? And they said they have to take, so they actually turn off the power within 30 milliseconds of a failure, which means by the time the wires fall to the ground, they've been turned off. Okay, that's what they do. So 30 milliseconds. So these kinds of high tension are not actually susceptible to tree strikes as far as I understand.
No, but there are other challenges for the utilities. So for instance, some of our customers have a regulatory need to prove
Yeah.
no vegetation.
Yes, yes, they do.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. So they send these crews with defoliants and chainsaws,
Yeah.
and they actually basically poison the ground under the transmission tower indefinitely. I mean,
I agree, I mean, obviously, again, this is always a bit of a challenge, right, when you're doing work in the real world. So
Yeah.
yes, some of our customers will probably be using herbicides in a way that if I wear my biodiversity hat, I would be
Yeah.
less keen on. Just, ethical questions come up a lot. We also have this question, how do we work with, for instance, the difference between a utility company that is burning coal and a utility company that's purely working on hydropower? These
No,
are
I
not
mean,
trivial
this-
questions for a business, right, to work out where you go, but.
and I'm not suggesting that all I'm saying purely from the perspective of the utility companies, they're heavily regulated.
Yeah.
And for the long distance transmission, they are required to, basically demonstrate anything within, I think, about 10 meters on both sides or something like that. And they do that. I used to live near a transmission tower, I know. So I would suspect that most of your strikes are happening in these, tier.
Yeah,
distribution
absolutely,
levels.
it's almost likely,
And-
but I just don't have a statistic.
No, I understand, yeah, but also it will be likely to be sort of suburban or very urban areas, because once you go into a very rural area, again, there aren't any trees there, okay, not very many trees, or if you go through vast wood lots or something like that, potentially. Because you're showing these pictures, these pristine landscapes and big pylons, and that's not where it is.
I can equally show you pictures showing, actual power lines coming through trees that have been trimmed so that the power line can go through the middle of the tree and we have, that's pretty common.
Yeah, yeah.
Google Street View, and I'll show you lots of interesting
Yeah.
power lines. But yeah, absolutely. And again, that comes back to all our customers are different. They're all
Yeah, yeah.
trying to do different things with their vegetation management. And some of them are trying to do things that reduce herbicide use.
Yeah.
Because if they can prove that there's no vegetation in the area with remote sensing, then maybe they can cut back on what would otherwise be a required herbicide program.
So the other thing which might be relevant, since nobody else has questions, I can put that. Yeah, let me just say, okay, I'll say one thing and I'll give you that is clear, which is that the other thing they need to do, especially in North America, is many of the transmission lines are wood. And they are these very tall lodge oak lines that encrypted with creosote. And the thing is, they last about 70 years, and many of them installed after the Second World War, they're all at the end of life. And the interface between the pole and the ground is where they they break. And so if you can detect a tilt that is what they were doing in Canada, where they were flying helicopters along these lines because they're going off into the north. And they were actually taking pictures and doing, AI analysis of the poles to see which they had to replace. They spent about $4 billion worth of replacement to be done of the wooden transmission line poles. So if you can find tilt or sag or any of these things, to them, that's actually even more important than trees. So it might be something for you to do.
That's a
Anyway.
good idea.
Just going back to the, how do you provide source of data? Have you looked at things like iNaturalist and so on as ways of incentivizing people to?
Potentially, we haven't used them yet. We've mostly been focused on using our own team when they happen to be in the vicinity of our customers. It's an interesting one. I think definitely on our agenda. It's always a challenge of sort of timeliness, locality, and accuracy. Measuring tree height is one of the things. It's a little bit annoying to do.
So you can't do tree height with that, but I just downloaded a big chunk of the iNaturalist photo data set, and the species detection is actually pretty good, right? Because you need two independent confirmations to make it research grade. You can filter by that, so you can do species filtering through things like iNaturalist, and then you figure out the multi-phase pictures that you take.
Actually, definitely, I'll check it out. Thank you. Again, we're also limited to where we have high resolution imagery to cross-correlate with, which isn't everywhere, but it's more places all the time.
That's right, these are all converging on their.
Yeah. That's absolutely all converging.
Hey, thanks.
Great. I have a slightly silly question. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what exactly is the contract for this 30 centimeter resolution imagery for what you're allowed to use it for and how much you're allowed to share it with research groups? Right? Because
It's just sadly limited. Sadly limited, unfortunately, yeah, it is.
So it's like you buy it with a specific purpose listed or, okay.
We can usually share it with our customers, but unfortunately, yes, it does get a little bit limited beyond that, so.
And if
yes.
you were to like train any models based on that, like how much are those models yours? How much could you share them with the public and say, hey, we have a really good model for
We can
understanding?
certainly use the imagery for training models, that's what we
Yeah.
do. Sharing those models, I would need to check some of the terms of service, and I think that hasn't been on our agenda because we're quite busy.
Yeah.
Trying to do trees for our customers, but it's a really good question, it's definitely a challenge, right, and it's been a learning for me, working with the satellite companies, at this sort of level, it is so different from working with the larger scale public data sets. Everything from how long it takes, so when we call up and say, can you take some pictures of this area? And then of us will say, sure, we'll get around to that. We'll see who else wants to take pictures in the area. So you kind of, essentially all the orders and imagery go into a invisible black box bucket. Airbus will be prioritizing them based on things like military get first shot of where the satellites are and what they take pictures of, and then they're trying to juggle all the other requests. If we place a lot of orders for imagery for, say, the same US state, we will actually compete with ourselves. Because there's only so many places, there's only so many satellites, there's only so many things they can do. So you can actually have some really tricky challenges to, and so then you wait, right? So we place the order, say, when are we going to get the image? Well, we don't know. They'll try to fly when they can, assuming, for instance, the military are not using those satellites that day, because the military are with them first. And then maybe it's cloudy. And so maybe you have to wait for a second pass, and then maybe they take some images and they send them over to you and they say, how do these look? And we're like, they're all clouds. I'm like, oh no, we've got to do it again. So it's like, it's an unknown amount of time actually before you get the images. Really interesting. And then of course you have to hope that they actually send them to you in a format that you expect. I will say, we have had odd metadata sometimes, totally different file formats to normal. Having standardized ingestion pipelines has been non-trivial, because even the same satellite provider, they're running satellites. It really is rocket science. It's astonishing they can do that, but the bit where they actually take some data from the satellites and send it to you, so that you can pay, not always very reliable. Quite surprising, the set of things that can go wrong there.
Very interesting.
So yeah,
You'll
good.
be preaching to the choir here.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much.
It's a-